My next guest will never forget the day her beloved father called her and asked her if her husband was home. The news he would deliver next shattered her world. To tell us more, I'm joined by Stephanie Morales-Beaulieu. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you wrote about a really tough journey that you went through, and of course, it starts with that phone call. What was he calling to tell you?
My dad was 60 at the time, and he was calling to tell me that he had been diagnosed with ALS. And at the time, I didn't know what that was, but he said it's fatal, there's no cure. And so even though I didn't know what the disease was or the road that laid ahead, I knew what those other two words meant. And I just remember instantly just feeling shock, sadness, just disappointment and all the just waves of emotion that come with news like that.
And you think, of course, when your dad's 60, that you have lots of time.
Tons of time,
with him left.
Yeah.
And, you were brought up by them to be a person of faith, but it's events like these that really test
absolutely
the reality of that. Like, God, how could you let this happen? Why my dad? All of that. So how are you spiritually trying to process that news?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that season was probably one for me where I need everything that I knew in theory, everything I learned, everything I read. I need to know right now that it's true and it's going to hold. And so my life had been fairly uneventful to that point. There'd been a couple of tougher losses, but they were always at an arm's length. This was the first, my family, close to home, something that just affected me in that deeper way. And so I remember kind of thinking, okay, this is happening anyways, and so I don't want any of it to be wasted. I don't want any of the pain to be wasted. I don't want the suffering to be wasted. So God, whatever it is that you have available to me, I want it, I need it. And so I remember, I haven't typically been a morning person in my life. And I remember in that season just getting up early and going, I need this daily bread for today. I need the presence of God to be very real in my life and very tangible, or I'm not going to make it through the day. And so for me, it was really a season of, I would say, testing, holding out, and just holding on to the promises of God.
And you start that journey with your dad, and they're telling him 3 to 5 years. That's initially what they were telling you, but it turned out to be much less, and it started to progress much faster. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so at the beginning, they kind of give everybody that diagnosis, the kind of 3 to 5 years, and then they kind of keep testing your breathing capacity. That's the biggest indicator of how much time you have, and it very quickly became obvious that it was going a little bit quicker. And so I remember the day when they said 3 to 6 months, and that was when it had just been about a year. And then, of course, when they said, 2 weeks or less. And so each one of those felt like another, just kind of shattering loss of, I thought we had more time, or I thought, things were going to go a little bit differently. And so it ended up being 15 months from when he was diagnosed till when he passed away.
So fast. And, you write about this in this book, Anything But Ordinary, which made me cry so much, by the way. Really hard to just hear the journey that you went through. But one thing I found, I was so inspired about your dad's faith. His faith never seemed to be shaken, no matter how fast he was losing things in his life and his abilities. Tell me about that.
Yeah, he always said, this disease cannot take the things that are the most important to me. And he said, my faith and my family. And of course, it was so hard to make sense of and, all those things. But I think just watching him just really cling to the promises of God and just to hold on was kind of an example, to follow in. And the book isn't only our ALS journey. It's also just kind of his life. And there was a lot of things that didn't go super well, or they were hard, or, there was obstacles in it and lots of opportunities, to have faith. So one thing I think that just was so foundational was that it wasn't the first time I saw him, walk by faith. It was kind of this pattern, in his life in really ordinary ways. This, of course, was a major one, but it wasn't like he had never trusted God. It wasn't like we'd never, walked by faith and, had to watch God provide what we needed for the month or those kinds of things. So it felt kind of almost like a culmination of this life that he had lived. And it really planted, deep seeds. I think when you see someone suffer and you also, you see the suffering in one hand and then you see them just testifying to the faithfulness of God and just holding on, then you go, well, if they can say that, with what they're going through right now, then I can too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you call the book Anything But Ordinary because he seemed like an everyday kind of person,
Very much.
right?
Yeah.
But he was extraordinary in so many ways about how he lived out his faith, even before this diagnosis.
Yeah, well, he was a mechanic by trade. He got saved at 37, so he had just lots of years of just, going to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday kind of thing, and, having a family. And he had immigrated from the Philippines, so, was looking for that kind of better life in Canada. And he was never really kind of like a spotlight kind of person. But I think the thing that I would say is kind of anything but ordinary was just this faith that he had. And faith, hope, and love, those are the things that really last. And he loved people. And, so now, like 13 years later, it's not like, he didn't have followers, he didn't have a platform, he didn't have any of the things that we have, like in 2023 that sometimes we're tempted to measure significance or impact by, but he loved people well and he followed Jesus. And I find now, even 13, 14 years later, when I talk to people, it's like they'll still talk about his faith, or they'll talk about, like how he loved them. And I just think that's a testimony to something he always told me, which was, he said, kingdom impact is about quality, not quantity. And I think if you go after one, you kind of sometimes still get the other. But he was never really after impact. He wasn't really after, he was just trying to follow Jesus, and that had a really big impact on people around him.
And it's so cool to hear that, because, you tell the story in the book, which I love. Your mom came to faith first, and she was trying so hard. Like, she would put like little pamphlets into your dad's lunch, posted with scripture. I'm sure that was really working. He was not only not interested, annoyed by it all. And then there's this moment where she takes him to the Billy Graham crusade, like the best preacher in the world. And he's giving the altar call, and she's like looking over to see if he's going to go, and he's sound asleep.
Snoring.
Right. So tell me how he did come to faith, because he really wasn't that interested in it.
No. And really, like, nothing she did was working, and none of her efforts. And so she prayed and, had this kind of turning point of the Lord just saying, like, I just want you to love him. And so at the Billy Graham crusade, she's like looking, she's like, what? Like, I planned the night, the football player was giving his testimony, and like, how do you fall asleep in Billy Graham? And, everyone, like, people are flooding the aisles, and he's, head back sleeping. And so that day she had a moment where she said, I can't save him. And God spoke to her and he said, you can't, but I can. And so the year and a half from when he got saved, I think, was like many failed attempts to try to save him or to try to like teach him spiritual things, and then just really surrendering. And when I was writing the book, my mom said to me, she goes, I should have given up sooner. Isn't that the truth? And so he had a Christian coworker that my mom didn't even really know about at the beginning. And when my mom got saved, supposedly he went to work, and this coworker, he said, Richard, my wife says she's born again. Is that a cult? And he just had no idea what had happened to her. And so this coworker, he was just doing his thing, going to work, showing up, and he would answer these spiritual questions. He said about once every 2 weeks. He'd like ask him a question, he'd mull over it, he'd kind of think there was no interest, and then he'd ask him something else. And so while my mom thought nothing was happening, he was, just beginning to be curious. And how does my wife, who doesn't even go to the same church as this guy, how are they telling me the same thing? And how does this all work? It was this very confusing thing to him. So he finally came to a point where he just decided, and he told my mom one night, I'm going to do it. And she's like, do what? Like mow the lawn, wash the car. And he said, I'm going to become a Christian tomorrow. And she was like, what?
No sign of success. What?
Yeah. And he said, no, not with you. He goes, you'll cry and get all emotional. He said, I'm going to go see your pastor. So tomorrow. So he went, of course, tried calling all day, no answer. And long story short, this is in the book in extended detail, but he ended up kind of giving up on the idea because he couldn't get a hold of the pastor. And then driving home from Vancouver to Richmond, he said his first ever prayer that wasn't a memorized one. And he said, God, I don't know if you know me, but you know my wife, Kathy. And he said, I have a problem. I was going to become a Christian today, but I can't get a hold of the pastor. If you're real, put him in the church. I'm turning left on Albion. It was the street. Anyways, 2 minutes later, you have to read the book to find out the rest of the story. But as you can imagine, God was real, and he revealed himself in a really powerful way that day. And that was the day he gave his life to Christ.
And the pastor was in the church.
He was in the church for like a minute. And it happened to be
the minute that your dad walked
coming through.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really touched me about the book is that, as your dad was losing the ability to walk, then he was losing the ability to talk, then he was, just being able to communicate through a message board. And despite all of that, he was leading his caregivers to have faith in God personally.
Yes.
And one of the caregivers said to him at the end that your dad was the talk, or I guess to your mom, your dad was the talk of the healthcare circle because there was something so different and peaceful about him. So you think about all the losses that he had to go through. Yeah. And yet they're saying there was something different and peaceful about him. Talk to me about just how he never stopped sharing about the love of God, even as he was suffering so much.
Yeah, he could not speak. He had a letterboard, and he could barely move his arms, so you'd have to support his wrist, and he would spell, words out. And the last person he led to the Lord, I think there was all 3 of his caregivers, and then the palliative nurse, and then the cleaning lady. All 5 of them came to know Christ. And the palliative care nurse had kind of gone to church as a kid, and she said, oh yeah, like I believe in God. And all he spelled was, even the demons believe. And she just had this, like the Lord just spoke to her. She was like, well, then what do I need to do? And he spelled, called my mom in, and she kind of finished up. But I think he had such a perspective of eternity. And I think his priority when he met people was always, like to love them, but to make sure that they knew what was available. And so I think the closer, I can only imagine, the closer he got to that day, the more urgency maybe, he felt, and kind of the thinner maybe that veil got between heaven and earth. And I think that God is just so merciful and good to, to not waste our suffering. And so even though he literally could not walk and talk, which were very important in his work as a pastor and a chaplain, he literally, that's what he did. And just to give him the gift of people who were just ready. And one thing that really impacted me as I was writing the book was going back through some of his journals, and something he regularly prayed was, God, intersect my life with people who are ready for the gospel. And I was like, yep, I'm gonna
take that
on, because sometimes I think we're like, I gotta try harder, I have to know what to say to people, or I have to find them. And I think when we just pray and just say, God, use me, here's my life, in whatever capacity we have, and he had such a limited capacity at the end, but God is just looking for people who are willing. And so I think he was gracious to just bring people who were ready just to answer that prayer.
Your dad did more in the last months of his life than most of us do in a lifetime. You all prayed for him to be healed, and he prayed for himself to be healed. Yeah. How do you spiritually process the fact that God's real and he did so many other miracles, but this one thing he didn't do?
That's a huge one. And I think for anybody who is suffering and, you're reading the Bible and you're reading the promises of God and you're trying to make sense of like, well, it says this, and I think and God healed people then, and, so surely he would do that now. And something that really changed my perspective was this woman named Liz, and this story is in the book, and she said to me one day, God will heal your dad. And I was like, I immediately felt this like, yes, this is okay, tell me more. Like, did he speak to you? And she said, it's just a matter of if it's on this side of heaven or the other. And that shifted the way that I understood healing that day. Because I think, of course, we want the promises of God on this side of heaven, always, right? We want to see our loved ones like healed. And, and one thing that happened in this season was you start to remember, oh yeah, this life is not all that there is. And when you're suffering, that actually becomes really good news, instead of, I want to squeeze this in and this in and this, all these things. I want to live before I die. You go, oh, well, this is actually just really preparing us. And so, just having that eternal perspective of God has all of eternity to fulfill his promises. And of course, I want it now. And of course, it's hard to understand a lot. And still to this day, like, man, the tears shed writing the book and even like rereading the book. I picked it up a couple weeks ago and I was like, oh, no, like
I cried.
Still, like there are still more tears. But like when you lose someone you love, like it's sad. And there will be a day where there's no more tears, and there will be a day where there's no more suffering and no more pain. And that day, as much as we want it to be today, that day is the day we see Jesus face to face. And so I think as we keep that eternal perspective, right, it doesn't make our suffering not hard, it doesn't make it not painful or sad, but it puts it in perspective of what we have waiting for us.
Yeah, and the truth is we're all going to die. Like none of us are getting out of this place alive, right? So to prepare ourselves with wisdom and a steadfast faith is so important. Thank you for sharing with us about Jesse's life. It was really, really beautiful.
Thank you for reading it and having me.
And for everybody watching this interview, I know that so many of you are suffering right now, or someone that you love just as much as Stephanie loved her dad is suffering, and you might be going through that pit. Life is complex, and it never actually works out exactly the way that we would have written it. That's part of giving up control to God and trusting him with the good and the bad and the ugly of our everyday life. I just want to encourage you that you are not alone, that you don't have to go through it alone. If you're a pastor's wife and you have doubts because of what you're suffering and you can't talk to anyone about it, or for any other reason, you can call our prayer lines, 100% confidential, and you're going to meet the most wonderful brothers and sisters in Christ on the other end of that phone line. Please give us a call right now. Don't suffer alone. You don't have to. And we're just going to bring some really practical encouragement into your life. 1-866-273-4444. I really hope you make that call.